Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of That's Initiative. I'm your host Chris, and joining me as always, we have Greg.
Hello, all.
Yeah. So, if you've not listened before, we're a role playing podcast. We talk about different tips and, well, topics really. So, this time we're going to be talking about planning a session out, whether it's going to be for a one shot or rolling through your campaign and planning like multiple sessions and how we tie together. So, it's probably going to be more geared towards DMs and new DMs for this one, but hopefully, there'll be some nuggets in there if you're a player as well. But yeah, I suppose we'll get right into it. What do you think of Greg for like if you're going to sit down and do some work on the session? If yeah, you're DMing our campaign at the moment, so how do you approach doing that?
So I use OneNote, the Microsoft program, recently converted. So I used to use Excel, and uh, it worked really good, but I think OneNote is much more user friendly. Right. I ended up with like these Excel spreadsheets with this is like endless tabs and so forth, and having to resize stuff for text, and it I think the new mode works a lot better. So I start off with my session one, and uh, so I've generated my sort of, we talked about meta last week, other campaign notes and stuff like that, and I lay out session by session notes. So I'll go session one, and then I'll kind of lay out what I want to get achieved. So like when I look at our session one that we ran, it's pretty straightforward. I put the date because I wanted to keep track of where we were in my calendar and stuff like that. Generate characters, get the party together, hand out letters of introduction, and just some notes about like who the characters are and who your mentors were. And then anything that doesn't get done, I just kick to my notes for the next session, right? And then I kind of, because you might plan a bunch of stuff and it might not get finished, or you might plan a bunch of stuff and the players blow through it.
Yeah,
So yeah, I just keep rolling it back into my notes and then adding. Um, yeah, and I think that's I worry about plotting content that is easily placeable.
yeah,
So I mean, I'm sure most people are aware, but maybe if you're new, the new person likes to generate what they think is super cool, and then they spend a lot of time on it, and then the party
and
almost can't evade it, right? Because the
yeah.
person I've spent all this time generating this encounter, so you guys are going to run into it no matter what you do. And it feels inevitable and linear and
Yeah, I think I'm getting caught up on Critical Role at the moment. I think I'm on like episode 33 now, and they're on like episode 72 of the second campaign.
right.
And there was an encounter, and so even like Matt Mercer, who's obviously widely regarded as a really good DM now because of Critical Role and the skills that he has. But he had an ending ambush. There was going to be two of them working together, but the players, like, it was awesome. They avoided it through one of them spoke giant, so he overheard them like planning the ambush, and then he cast charm on the ending and and was talking to him. And this other one came out, and one of the other wizards cast fear on it, and it failed its test. So one of them ran away, and the other one was just really friendly. So he basically made it all the way down the ravine, and then he just like rotated it, and then had them figure out that something had gone wrong and run after them. So they still had the encounter, and it didn't feel forced. It was still fun because of the way they role played and described it. These endings obviously running up, trying to catch up to the wagon train that they were supposed to ambush on its way past. But again, it kind of felt almost cheated in that they you're punishing the players for having done something really cool that avoids your encounter.
Right.
But if that's the only content you've got, you're kind of in a rock and a hard place of how you go about it. If we don't engage with content, we're going to need to take a break. So I'm going to need to plan something else,
Right.
and that kind of thing. So I think it's getting buy-in from the players as well can be difficult sometimes if because you don't want to feel like you're being arbitrary in your punishments for them and like forcing them into your encounters if they've done something that deserves to avoid it or come at it from an angle you've not expected.
Right. So the one thing that I did that I felt would be helpful, um, some of it was my own content that I generated it. Some of it was content. Uh, I like have a lifetime of resources.
Yeah,
So I went through Dungeon Magazine and I poured through all 150 issues. So it took me a while. And I found maybe a dozen potential scenarios. And then um, not taking them word for word, but just sort of wrote into my OneNote uh, sort of notes about it and stuff like that. So uh, I'm always, when I'm planning my session notes, I'm like, the potential is that I can insert one of these adventures in this session. And so, like, I just like link it. So I'm like, if I run out of things to do, or if the situation presents itself properly, I can take one of my pre-generated scenarios. And so a lot of them, I broke them down into road ones, wilderness, and town.
yeah,
So the one with the tailor, for instance, is one of the ones that I had prepped. And so I can work on that independently without worrying about placement. And then when the time comes and I'm like, oh, I'm like looking for something to do. And either sometimes you just have that, the writer's block, planning
yeah,
block, creative, imaginative block. And you're like, well, so rather than focus on it, I'm just going to put something in and, yeah, and then we'll see, how that all plays out.
yeah. I
So,
think that the writer's block's a really good example. Scott, who joined us for our Call of Cthulhu two shot, do you call it? I don't know. Mini campaign, I suppose.
oh,
He
Sam.
Sam, Sam,
Yeah.
not Scott. Sorry. And it was an S. I've only met him twice now. Um, Sam, who he came in the store on Friday night, I think, when I was doing some receiving, and he was asking for some advice because he said he's got writer's block. After we were chatting about stuff on Tuesday night after a session, he said he'd been inspired by a couple of ideas, but he bought the Guilds of Ravnica book
Yeah.
and he teleported his plan on he's either done it or was planning on teleporting his players out of Storm King's Thunder into this setting because some of the players had already played Storm King's Thunder.
Gotcha.
So he didn't want to run through content that he knew they'd played. So he teleported them into here, but then Ravnik is an awfully big place to suddenly have to plan for a session.
Right.
So he said he was really struggling, had writer's block on that. I was like, well, there's a couple ways to approach it. Right. One, you don't need to show your players Ravnica. You need to show your players the tavern they're going to stay in that night. And
Right.
then an encounter designed around the immediate vicinity. And I think that's a good way of trying to don't approach writer's block from trying to brute force your way through it. You treat it as you just put, like I say, put it aside and work on something else. And then because it's such a big concept, and I suppose it comes into a meta plot stuff we were talking about last week. But the other things I always try to do, whether it's for a session or an encounter within a session, is I go through like the what's, the where's, and the why's, and they don't all have to be tied to a meta plot and something like that. But it'd be like, why did you send the players to Ravnica? Obviously, you know why you as Sam did it to the players, but why did the characters go to Ravnica?
Right. Yeah.
So it doesn't need. It could be an accident. It could be someone took them there. It could be that they voluntarily went there. There's multiple reasons why it could have happened, and just try and just bullet point it out. So I'm tried OneNote for this Call of Cthulhu thing I'm running at the moment. It's my first time using it, and I see the benefits of it. But when I was running the Warhammer, I did it all with pen and paper. I did very little of it online. I used my laptop and stuff. I did do it for like handouts and stuff so I could print them out if I needed multiple copies of something. But I find I'll do like brief overviews and bullet points for a lot of my stuff and work from that. And then the way I've structured this was I did it as 2 sessions, but because I wasn't sure on timing and content, I made 3 acts for my sessions.
Right.
So Act One, Act Two, Act Three, and then Act Two can act as that buffer between the two, like the intro to what's going on, and then the culmination of what's happened, and then a wishy-washy part that can fill the time of the later of the 2 sessions. So
I think the pen and paper side of things is really important as well. So that's inevitably how it starts. I have like a little pad of notepaper here on my computer, and whenever I get an inspiration, I kind of write it down, and so that way I don't lose it, or it doesn't get twisted from what the original vision was.
yeah,
Right? So if I have this inspiration and I write it down, I capture it. And then it's not like me trying to go back and go, oh, what was I thinking? Oh, I don't remember. And inevitably it isn't fresh. It isn't the way you originally thought about it. And then you spend more time worrying about trying to remember it. So I just kind of write it down. And then I end up with just pages and pages of notes. And then I sort of every once in a while kind of go through and then I just cross stuff off and move it over into my more solidified notes. And the
yeah,
reason why I suggested when we were talking about this, when you were prepping for Call of Cthulhu, the OneNote was really cool. I do all the work on my desktop and then I run the game from my laptop and I don't
yeah,
have to worry about transferring it because it's all stored to your OneDrive account and stuff like that. And yeah, I just found that part was excellent.
yeah. I'll see if I can bring it up for people watching the YouTube video while we're talking, but I'll show off my OneNote that I've been working on anyway.
I'll
But
cover my eyes.
it's it's fine. We're pretty much through it all anyway, so I'm not overly worried. Um, but yeah, I find the pen and paper stuff is a lot better for my stream of conscious type work. I feel like like I say, I get the flow of what I'm thinking about, and I can be a lot more disorganized and then come back and write it up. But
Yeah.
then when I'm typing, I find I'm a lot more deliberate with it. So I'll reject ideas before I've put them down, where that idea might have been better served at a different point, but because I've rejected it, like you say, it becomes a stale idea or not quite what I intended and that kind of thing. So I mean, I've tried to do it on OneNote that I have a general overview tab for each of the I've got an overview for each for the, like the campaign.
Yeah.
Then I have an overview for each of the tabs. That each of the acts has got its own little overview, and then it goes from there. So, yeah, so I've got it up now for people watching. But I have in my overview, I've got setting notes where I talk about like, an intro, and I tried to prepare it as if so that I could hand this to you and you could run it, having
Right.
never played it. So I try and structure it as if I was writing a module. So I have an intro, and then I've got like the adventure split over 3 main parts. I name them off. I go through. I give some like flavor text. I've got all the maps and different things. Then I have a big map of like the Lovecraft County, like the giant map, and then I've got like my handouts. So I love handouts and stuff. I enjoy making them for my games.
Right.
So
I think inevitably that type of stuff brings players to more present.
yeah,
Engages the players. That's the word.
especially I find them useful of the type of games I tend to run. Like I think we discussed it on the Metapod one where we were talking about doing shorter games over like long running campaigns and stuff like that. Because if we've only got 2 sessions to play this, so you're not going to have time to really delve into your character and like develop it. So to try and hook you into a world, I try and give you stuff that grounds you directly into it. So we've got the desktop calendars and the letters, and I think I gave you a library card with your
Yeah.
character's name on it, and all of that stuff. And I'm working on handouts for the next batch, which you'll hopefully find, or else I've just wasted all my time. But I really enjoy handouts and trying to think of how they'll fit in.
And
And I
that
do,
layout that you were talking about, where you kind of step by step uh, lay out your session for yourself, means that you are less likely to have like what happened with you, where you forgot to give us the thing and we found it in the chest, that the diary, right? So
yeah,
you're like, important bullet points. At this point they should have the diary. At this point they should have this. At this point they should have that, right?
yeah,
And for a more sustained game, when I have my notes, but then when we start playing, at the top of my notes, I actually type in everything sort of in bullet point again, what you guys actually do,
yeah,
right? So I can look back and go, I remember them being in this town, but I don't really remember what went down. And I can like go back, 4 or 5 sessions, and oh, that's right, they like, talked to this person and they talked to that person and this person told them this. And so all the things that sort of foreshadows where you're inspired at the table and you're like, well, this would be cool. This, I'm going to foreshadow this with this. If if you forget it or you don't note it down or whatever, inevitably the players question you about it later, and it's always a great reference to be able to go back and sort of say, oh, this is, you go back and say, oh, in session 3 they spoke to the mayor, the abbess in the town, and she told them this, and and because inevitably it's very hard to keep all that straight
yeah,
in your head, right?
yeah. I think the main things when going back to the full on planning a session thing, like one of the first things I try to do is decide if I want it to be a more combat focused session or a role playing session or an investigation session. I kind of have those three tabs, as it were,
Sure.
where like, are we if we're gonna be in the middle of a dungeon because that's where we left off last week, it's probably gonna be combat.
Right.
If you're on the road, you can have you can have them get ambushed on camp. You can have them meet a traveling salesman. There's those kind of things, and the role playing ones I'd consider like the meeting with the gypsies in the caravan.
Sure.
I felt like for me it was a really good role playing session. Obviously, there was the potential for it to turn into a combat encounter, but that was reliant on the role playing first.
And I think
And
that's really important, like exactly what you said, that when you're generating a session, you're generating content, which is role play, combat, which is resolution, right? And there's sliders. So you kind of have a feeling for how you think it will go, but the players inevitably are unpredictable.
yeah,
And so yeah, and so I think you lay it out, but you try to remain fluid. And I think the one thing is, the more comfortable you are with the game, so the more familiar you are with the, like, just the mechanical side of the game, the less you have to worry about how things, you're not looking up rules, you're not trying to figure out how you're going to resolve this situation. You can spend more time watching your players at the table, and you can sort of see who's engaged, who isn't engaged, and what the content you're currently running, you can sort of flex it towards the, one, or bring everybody back to the table, which
yeah,
ultimately you're just trying to get that engagement, right?
yeah. One of the key things I do 100% every time, I picked this up probably about 3 or 4 sessions into running that Warhammer campaign for you guys, where I was tired of not having to flick through my notes to find the stuff I wanted. So I do the quick cards, just the Filofax cards. I
Yeah,
buy
recipe cards. Yeah,
yeah, but they're like a hundred for like $5 or whatever.
sure.
and I use those for almost everything in my game. I have all of my NPCs I'll put on them. I'll just sit and write some out. And what I did for Warhammer, I've not done it for this one because it's a lot more confined, but I'll actually generate 4 or 5 different people who I can drop into any locations and have them in my back pocket.
Sure.
So it'll be a generic vendor. So if you guys go, oh, I want to go and see a tailor, I'm like, what? I didn't foresee you wanting to go and buy a new hat. I've not prepped a tailor, but I can just pull this guy and just like a personality trait, a bit of a quirk, so that if you give the players a detail, they'll feel like you've prepped something, and it immerses you more in the world. So having the shopkeeper with a lisp, I'm really good at doing those ones. All of my shopkeepers and NPCs, it's fine. Um, but that kind of like little detail, you just have it on, or they have the giant peacock feather in the hat. Just note something on the
Sure.
and the general. Are they going to be easy to barter with? Because the players are always going to try, and that kind of thing.
Right.
Or are
You
they
want to
going?
outline their personality, outline what what their agenda is. Where do they fit in the world? Right? Are they angry at the world because somebody's opened up a tailor shop across the street from them?
Yeah,
So the players come in and the dude is surly, and you don't know why, and you're like, well, what are you so mad about? Oh, well, so and so opened across the street, and his work is terrible, but he charges less, and people are cheap, right?
yeah,
And I mean stuff like that. So I think the cards. So I did the same. I did all my magic items on cards before, and I did a lot of NPCs and stuff like that. Once you get more comfortable with your layout, same thing again within OneNote, you can just create an NPC tab and then just have all these NPCs in the NPC tab, right? And I just
so
put their like their profession
yeah,
and then their first name. And then in the actual description, I have all my notes on them and stuff like that. So, like you said, when I'm looking for Taylor, or I'm looking for an armor, or I'm looking for a guild mage or something like that, I just have it all sorted alphabetically in the NPC tab. And then I might have 3 guild mages. And
yeah,
then when I use it, I just put an asterisk in front of it.
yeah. For one note, I've been dragging stuff into its relevant, like for me, because I've got the accent and the locations broken down. So
Yeah,
I kind of think of them as movie sets.
sure.
So, for example, we played. So I'll briefly introduce what I did for people who are kind of interested. I wanted to try and just do something quick. I had like 3 days, I think, to prep something for us. But when we'd actually confirm it, we're going to play it. So I stole sorry, I lifted the the storyline from the Arkham Horror card game intro box. So we're basically playing through the Night of the Zealot campaign, but in Call of Cthulhu rather than in Arkham Horror. So I took those locations. I was like, okay, so you start off in the study. So first off, I need to get them all into a study. But I couldn't do that until I knew what characters they had. So that was all ad libbed at the table, and I like crowbarred everybody together. But it was relatively believable. I feel like it'll all come together at the end. It'll be fine.
Yeah, the less as players, especially the very first session, if you want to get playing, the less resistant you are to the game master's machinations to push you together, the
Yeah,
quicker you'll get on with the game.
yeah. You There's nothing wrong with you all meeting in a tavern
Sure,
because it's easy and gets dice rolling. So
sure. Yeah,
just
exactly.
roll with
Right.
it.
Yeah.
But then I have my act one. I've got my overview of what's happening. I've got like stuff I want to say out loud. So I've not like given myself a script, but like this is how I want to present stuff. This is when I want to trigger tests for you all to take. What happens on different levels of passing the tests. Then I've got my stages. So I've got my main floor locations and I've got them in 3 different boxes for like the kitchen, the cellar, the parlor, and the hallway and how it all fits together. So I have like notes on notable things to see in this location when you like what's it smell like? What's the temperature? that kind of thing, just to because it's a haunted house type feel.
Sure.
Effectively, I want to immerse the players in it. So rather than trying to think of it on the fly, I find just having those bullet points in there better. And then I've also got what's in those rooms that they can find. So in the kitchen, I put some meat cleaver, some lantern, and some kerosene. And then I wrote out stats for meat cleaver so that I can hand the card to a player.
Sure.
So I know
And
what a
that,
meat,
that was useful. I mean,
yeah,
that meant that we didn't end up having to waste time looking it up. And interesting or a nice addition to that when you're like laying it out, you attach the skill checks in your notes to
yeah,
what if they need in Call of Cthulhu terms, spot hidden or whatever. And so the thing with Call of Cthulhu, since it's so skill based and it there's progression through success, you want to give the players the like you don't it's like in 5e, you don't want them just rolling perception investigation perception investigation, right? You want to try to spread it out a little
yeah,
bit.
survival, Nate. I think said it really well to Jim at the table. I think the other week. Um, it was something about you were rewarding Jeff for having taken survival. I think it was. I can't remember. It
Right.
was one of the skills that Jeff had. And it's he's taken like 3 rolls on that today. Well, yeah, but you've also had your times when you have your hidden rolls.
Well, and that's
So
why 5e that sometimes I restrict to trained,
yeah,
right? So that there, like there's times when you're going to give out a certain amount of information regardless of the role. So they all can
yeah,
roll so that they all feel involved. Now I'm breaking the barrier, right? Um, but there's times where they're going to get some information and you want to give them some bonus information. And so linking that to a skill check that the players can make if they succeed, then you give them something, they give them like the cherry on top. You give them a little bit of extra, right, to reward them for making the choice. But like in Call of Cthulhu, having there's so many more skills, and I think from a player side of things, it's important that we get the opportunity to roll on a bunch of different skills because once we succeed, the potential exists that it can improve,
yeah.
right? So D&D less so because your skills are sort of set.
Well, the
Uh,
way I do it for D&D is I group them into categories, and I think that it's easier if you know your players' characters before you design the session. If
Sure.
you're designing a one shot, you what think can be played by anyone. Like the way I approached writing this one was as if I was writing a module for people to pick up and play. So if I was doing that for D&D, I you'd have to engineer it. So like you say you don't want to have all of your skills to be focused on one player. So if you're playing a bunch and the party's only got one ranger and you're doing lots of survival and tracking, a ranger's going to have loads of fun and feel like they're really involved. The wizard and the fighter and the rogue are all going to be like, oh well, it's a bit dull, isn't it? Because they're just sat back watching the ranger do his thing.
Right.
So you that's why you need for checking for traps. You need to have the
No, they
discerning
find
traps and
they find the stone with the glyph on it. You want to bring every player back, and so the ranger finds the stone and it's got some sort of glyph, and then you're like, hey wizard, don't you have arcana? Yes, I do. He comes up there and he like examines it, and then he gets, so everybody's involved. Yeah, so I think that's super important, right?
yeah,
That you well-rounded, uh that you're not, it's very easy to focus on a couple things. So there might be, it might take you a little bit of extra time when you're designing the session, but you can have multiple checks or multiple avenues to accessing that information. So it's, perception or investigation or whatever is one side of things, right? But there's also other ways of you know that type of thing, right? Where you give them multiple entrances, so there's multiple chances for the.
Yeah, I think we covered that quite well in the what makes a good session, which obviously these those two episodes will go hand in hand, really. Like this one and that one, if you
Right.
work them together, you
If
should
you've
get
laid
the
it out properly,
yeah,
then you're going to succeed in achieving a good session.
yeah, and like, but I think like specifically looking at the players you have and what skills they have available to them, and trying to maximize the participation of different people. And I think we discussed in the Metaplot episode where we spoke about like trying to vary whose story it is at the moment. If it's the paladin's time to shine, it's okay for them to get more of the content geared towards them, and the group should like hold them up as a paragon that they will be for that episode. But then you need to be balancing that. You still want everyone else to, even if they're a supporting cast, they should still have some lines. No one wants to be the red shirt in the episode for the entire episode.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's pretty key.
Um, what about like pacing the planning of it? Like, do you how to phrase the question? Do you go about it so that it's relatively open on the way it's approached, or do you try and um, like that it works in this order, and like you need all these pieces of the jigsaw to put it together, or do you just have all of the pieces available from the start, kind of thing?
So, two. I think there's two things there. So you're asking as far as like layout and filling up your session.
Yeah,
The longer your game, so in a longer game, like in a campaign, rather than a one shot or a two shot, uh, you can keep pushing stuff, bringing stuff forward, pushing stuff back. So you can just fill up your content, right? Like I've probably got content plotted 2 or 3 sessions ahead of where we are at currently,
yeah,
and I can move it around, right? This happens here or this happens there, but so when I lay out what I think is, I always try to plan maybe 50% more material than what I think you're actually going to consume, and then I can just lift it and move it back. Whatever you don't get finished, then I don't need to just worry about it.
yeah.
Um, and I mean, the other side of things is that I don't know. I don't know what like. How do you deal with it?
So I try to think of my sessions as either one 3 hour block or two 2 hour blocks with a break, and that's how I try and plan it out. And so I'll run through. I tend to think a combat encounter I can plan to last an hour, no matter what the encounter is.
Sure.
If I need to speed it up, the thing will have less hit points. If I need to drag it out, something else will turn up. Uh, that the encounter can become more complex as needed.
That's the easiest thing to
Yeah,
determine pacing.
yeah. So a combat encounter is relatively easy. It's the role playing one. So I think I try and give a minimum expectation of the players will probably engage with this for about 10 minutes is normally a pretty good window. At 5 to 10 minutes is relatively easy for any setting you give them because you're going to take time describing it, and then there'll be questions and engagement, and you can throw you can throw the NPC at them, and then they can engage with the NPCs around it, and it kind of becomes a mishmash of you asking them questions from one angle while say might be trying to pursue a different angle with somebody else, and you get a flow of conversation and community from different people. And then I inevitably there's a little bit of table talk and like discussing what they're learning, trying to plan it out. And I try and do if I want say I'm doing a one of them like if I split it into two 2 hour blocks, generally I'd try and have um 45 minutes worth of role playing, an hour's worth of combat, 15 minutes of grey area,
Yeah.
and then the same again in the second one, and that feels like a nice balanced encounter, or like a nice balanced session. And it whereabouts you throw it, like you can have them get ambushed as soon as you go into a bar. There could be a bar fight that they get dragged into. Someone could, catch them with an elbow type thing, or um, I think the pickpocket's always a classic one. You can have an encounter that isn't combat per se, but forces dice rolls and tests and gets the players thinking.
Yeah, I think that
And
that pacing and plotting are more relevant in one shot. Like if you're planning on running 1 or 2 sessions, a very short campaign, you, uh, I think that making sure that your content fits your time slot is more of a challenge than, like I said, in the longer game, you can just move stuff around like that. That's easy to customize, right? You that's not a problem. So
yeah,
what I did when I was doing one shots, so like as a reference, when we used to play in one of the older games, when we were missing more than one player, I would just pull up a one shot and we would just that had a lot of newer players. We were playing with some of the employees from the store that were unfamiliar. So I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity for them to play character classes that they have not had any exposure to.
yeah,
So with pre-generated characters, yeah, so forth, right? But what I did was I need to be at this point after hour one. I need to be at this point after hour two, right? So I can see where I am. I can see my watch. I have 15 minutes to get to the end of hour one. It may mean that I have to, like, do I need to include everything? Or do I need to, like, add something? Yeah. And so that, I mean, that's just, you have a target. And if you're running a 3 hour session, that's perfect. You just break it down into little blocks and then that's easier to manage rather than, because like you said, if you're at 30 minutes and they've eaten all your hour one content, you realize that you can't just push it all forward
yeah,
because you're just going to shortchange yourself at the end. So now let's find something to insert in that second block of hour one that's going to eat up 30 minutes, right?
yeah,
So they either got you send them off on a wild goose chase or a dead end, or give them a little bit of a combat, or something that's going to fill up 30 minutes, and then you're back to the story, and then you're an hour two, and then you move it along.
yeah. So a good example, I think, was the Act One, Act Two, Act Three thing I spoke about for my Call Cthulhu uh, one I'm doing. So I planned it out that Act One is they meet in a house, spell gets cast, and the house becomes like a haunted mansion type thing. There's caverns below it that all lead back into the same room. There's a little bit of like warped physics and stuff like that. So you get to do a lot of wandering around and experiencing the mythos of Cthulhu, and I think that kind of dragged you into the game.
Right.
And then that ends with some combat, and it there's a combat encounter in one of the rooms. That's relatively simple. You've got to be really unlucky, even if you're playing it one on one. You've got to be pretty unlucky for this combat to go against the players. And I seeded lots of weaponry around the house, so it was quite obvious that this is probably going to happen. And then for
But you
the
had, but in that you had thorough players. Well, the players, no, no, but the players were thorough.
yeah,
So lots of times players will just rush,
yeah,
and you know they'll have missed all this stuff that you've carefully laid out, right? And then as a game master, you're like, well, this is not. You can see where it's headed,
yeah,
right? So if we hadn't gone into the kitchen and found the butcher knife, or we hadn't gone up into the attic or something like that, right? We might not have had everything that you felt like we would have at our disposal when the time came for the fight. And
yeah.
then,
So I think obviously Cthulhu is slightly different in that you have the expectation that there's things that you can't fight. in D&D, I don't think that's ever going to be too much an issue. I think the only semi-equivalency would be if you throw the players into an encounter where they need a magic weapon and they don't have them.
Right.
And I feel like you can plan around that. You know what I mean? Like
Well, we
you
were.
won't.
I was playing in a session 2 weeks ago, and we were fighting these like scrolls that were like giving us paper cuts. And when we
Yeah,
cut them with our weapons, our weapons were just shredding them through. And then the game master said to us, "Hey, do none of you have magical weapons?" We're like, No." He's like, "Oh," and I could see the like look on his face, like, "Uh-oh," right? So that I took to mean we are now going to have to find a different resolution than fighting our way out of this.
yeah,
And I don't think the rest of the group saw like they were feverishly looking through their character sheets where I was maybe it's because more of a game master than a player. I was watching the game master. So when the game master asked me that question, the first thing I did was watch his reaction when we said no,
yeah,
right? So then I was like, okay, well, we clearly need to have magic weapons to fight our way out of this. So we are going to have to find a different resolution for it, right? And then trying to convince the other players without, you know, the,
railroading them.
well, it's not even, it's just like the that particular game master is very much on atmosphere and he really dislikes it when you sort of talk out of like, you start meta thinking, right? Where
Yeah,
you're like, yeah. And so I was like, okay, well, I could have said, when the game masters asked us if we had magic weapons and we said no, right? I could have like outed him,
yeah,
or I could have just said that this is clearly not working, right? Tried to reason it out like your character, and then eventually we got on board and we grappled the paper, and uh, then we had our mage burning hands, the like two of us holding up these scrolls towards him. We got burnt, and they got burnt, and we gave the game master an out.
yeah.
I don't know if that's the way it should have worked, but the game master realized, and we were like locked in this room. So there was no getting out. So this was a TPK unless we could come up with a solution, right? And I think that was due to a lack of planning. Like you said, right? You need to know what your players are capable of. So
Yeah.
items. If you're going to put a monster in your session that has resistances or requires a magic weapon or whatever, you have to, or the players might be unsure. Well, I guess I'll use the example. If I wanted to, I'm kind of outing it, but so there'll be doppelgangers showing up later in my game. So the doppelganger that appeared in the sewers with you guys was
Yeah,
there to expose you to the potential that
that there's
not
that they
everything.
exist. Yeah,
That's right. So for me to wait till the most crucial moment where you guys need to figure out that this person is not who they seem,
yeah,
right? And then expect it to work out. I think you're setting your players up for failure if that's the way you're doing it.
right. I think if you're going to run a low level encounter, or if you're planning a session and you want to have something that requires magical weapons, you personally, if I'm going to lock you in a room with something that needs a magical weapon to defeat, there will be a magical weapon somewhere in that room.
Right.
I'm not. It's not going to be the mana sword in Hyrule that's glinting in the in the Zelda games type thing. It'll be a bit harder to find than that, but there'll be a way. And then it's on you guys as players to overcome that.
Sure.
And in this Cthulhu one, I don't think it's the end of the world. If you don't, you'll be doing spot hidden tests, and I'll be telling you that there's a revolver here, there's a baseball bat mounted on the wall, there's a meat cleaver in the kitchen. If you
Right.
choose not to take them, that's on you. But then when some ghouls charge at you, if you decide to fight them, that's also on you.
Sure.
Right? Running away is a perfectly valid response, and the way it went, we we had the D&D player moment where he charged into them to try and stab the ghoul priest, and then all of his support was pulling backwards and was going to set fire to the house. I'm like, well, if you're not coming, you're going to burn to death in here with everyone else, and it's not my problem because the rest of us not being eaten by ghouls becomes a more primary concern to us looking heroic saving you.
Right. Part of that though is that the inexperienced players.
Oh,
So two of the three players are relatively inexperienced as far as the game system goes, and so knowing that they have a more D&D-esque mentality, right, means that I think you have to be cautious. Like it's just like if you're going to put a monster in your game that has some sort of resistance or whatever, right? Then I don't know, maybe it was Colville that said it. He's like, if you're going to spring something on the players, at least give them the opportunity to have seen it or been exposed to it in the past, right? So the average player might not realize that you need a magic weapon, right? And so you need to be narrative and describe, they slash at it and, it, you know, you're narratively explaining it to them. And if they still don't get it, right, then maybe you just, need to just, especially, it depends on the player,
yeah.
right?
So I think that covers combat quite well. I think obviously making sure you're preparing an encounter that's maybe it doesn't necessarily always have to be challenging. You can have encounters that are purely designed to eat up time that should be relatively simple for the players. Because not every roadside bandit is going to recognize higher level parties. And I think stuff like that's a good opportunity to show the advancement of the players as they've leveled up. The kind of thing like they could be being harassed by a tribe of kobolds at level 1, and then when they leave the town in level 5 after they've done the thing, the same tribe of kobolds could attack them again, and they just get steamrolled by the party, and they feel like these guys were really challenging earlier on, and we just like a fireball here and a lightning bolt over there, and suddenly like 2 rounds we dealt with like 20 kobolds. It was awesome.
Right.
Just encounters designed to like fill up time. But I think that's a good summary of like planning combat encounters, making sure that what if they're going to be challenging, they shouldn't be impossible. I don't think personally I would never plan a combat encounter that was designed for the characters to be captured alive.
Yeah,
Uh,
like if that's your out when they screw it up.
yeah, I would if I wanted to capture characters alive, it would be done narratively without like combat happening.
Or through role playing, through some other thing. If you have them captured alive because of combat, it's because the combat didn't play out the way you'd envisioned it, and you're
I
just trying to give them an out, right?
Yeah, I think that it's the old like Vorpal sword issue you spoke about last time.
Yep.
That no, in fact no, you spoke about the Vorpal sword on Tuesday night.
Yeah, we were
But
just talking about it.
yeah,
Don't include items or things in your game that without thinking about the contingencies of the consequences of putting them in your game. That's huge, right? Deck of many things, Vorpal Blade, all those things. You can have them in your game, but the, you have to
you have to then live with the consequences.
for sure,
But
absolutely.
and it's like if I'm running a combat encounter that I want to capture all the characters alive, so my enemies are like grappling or striking to stun, and one of the characters got a Vorpal sword and it's just 2 turns of decapitating people, my I can no longer, in good faith, roleplay these enemies as still striking to stun when people are getting heads lopped off left and right. You know, at some point they need to start trying to act like people,
Or running away.
and
Yeah, no, for sure, right? And I
yeah,
think that's the one thing that I think we sort of briefly touched on that's really important as far as we talked about it being a slider. combat, role playing. I don't remember what the third one was.
Yeah. It was like the investigation style of
Oh yeah,
stuff where like
yeah,
that role playing I class as the Davina classics of going to a pet store,
sure.
doing your shopping, interacting with the environment in a way that doesn't necessarily advance the story.
So it all starts off at 33%. 33% combat, 33% roleplay, 33% investigation,
I'm trying to progress the story, I think.
yeah. And then within each session, you can slide the sliders around. So you might have a little bit more combat at the expense of investigation, or you might have a little bit more roleplay at the cost of combat. What you don't want to have happen, unless in the rarest of circumstances, you do not want the whole 100% combat. Right.
Yeah,
It's fine to have one session. Like you guys are in the sewers. I planned it to last 2 sessions. But even then, it it was what 20% investigation. But once you found the lair, you were just fighting.
yeah,
Right. It was just combat, 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 combat. You don't want to have session after session after session of session after session of just that. Was you want to vary it up so that uh, everybody, because not everybody is all like, yes,
you've
D&D
got
is
to make
combat.
sure your players haven't signed up to play Diablo. They're trying to play Baldur's Gate, and
That's right. Yeah.
if you're throwing Diablo at them all the time, it's
So it's important as well to reward them for the other things that aren't combat. Because like D&D being an experience driven game, they're like, well, we have to kill things to go to level. So, we're going to go like looking for fights so that we can, so it's important for you to like when they when they do when they have a great interaction, you give out an inspiration point or give out some experience or something like that. So that inspiration point that they got from role playing will definitely come in handy when they get into combat and they may get in over their head, right? And all those things. I think it's really important to equally monetize each section so that the players are rewarded for whatever choice they made, and they don't feel like beating things to death with a stick is the only option.
yeah. So, how do you plan out your actual investigation side of it? So the stuff that you want, well, you're going to try and make the players advance the story rather than you narratively do it. So where they have to gather the information and put, two and two makes four type thing.
Yeah, so I think you lay it out so that you have a clear train of thought. A leads to B leads to C leads to D, so that you're not confused. I think that's essential. It's really important that you understand the chain of events that have to occur so that you don't get confused and you're like, well, were they supposed to talk to this person or they were supposed to talk to this person, right? You lay it out so that it goes this. Same thing, and you just check it off as the players accomplish it. And then you look at pacing. And so sometimes the players are just ploddingly slow and it gets to be monotonous. And then you just like either you can replace an investigative step with a narrative step. So they go to talk to this person and you realize that I don't know, they've just been taking too long or they're like trying to dot all their I's and cross all their T's, right? So when they get to like person two that they're supposed to talk to, this person gives them more than their fill of info. You can
Yeah,
eliminate some of the steps. And it might mean you eliminate step 4, step 6, like much further down the road, but you're sort of you can push the story along if you feel like the pacing is off, that this person can be, or rather than them figure out who they're supposed to go see next, that NPC can direct them, right?
yeah. I think I'll bring it back to what I've been currently doing. So this is where I'm up to like the investigation part now. 'Cause we like act. Act One took up the whole of the first session. So then Act Two was the more investigating and role playing side of it. So I've laid it out for my Act Two description. I've got what the investigators learned from Act One, just summarize for me in case you're reading it. If you again trying to make it friendly to outsiders, people can sit down and read this, get caught up. There's some little bits of conversation from the NPC that you can give them. And then I've broken it down into potential leads that the players can instigate from what they've learned from the first section. And then I've laid out the conspiracy overall and like, a couple of key players in that conspiracy and whereabouts they can find information or where those people are and how those interactions will work. And then I've got one if stuff's stalling, this encounter can happen to force things along. And it's a combat encounter just to add a little bit of spice and pacing to it.
Mhm.
If it's starting to stall out, you want to reinvigorate the game. So I've got like an any location if the investigation is stalling, this thing can happen. And then I've got my conclusion of how all of that should lead to and what information the investigators should gather so they can move on to a final step.
Right.
And I think my conclusion's got like three parts, and it's all really brief stuff because I'm still working on these two parts of it at the moment. But it's like three little paragraphs, like three single sentences, effectively, like these bits of information that they should have, and like there's multiple ways of them getting there. I think I've got four different paths that you can choose to work from, and the potential would be that the players should only have time to do maybe two of those, couple of the conspiracy ones that they lead into, because each potential lead theoretically leads into at least one of the conspiracies,
Yeah,
and
you
then
tie it all
those,
back together.
yeah, and then those all interlink,
Right.
and that actually makes it sound more complicated than it is when I kind of describe it that way. But it's
Right.
literally a case of like, without spoiling anything too much for you, you find a newspaper article when so I gave Greg's character some books to deliver, and when they unwrapped the packaging of books, a newspaper article that had been clipped from a newspaper fell out that Greg didn't package in those books. So that's immediately odd, and it's a handout that I gave to the players.
Right.
So that like there's names in that article. There's the name of the author of the article. There's the name of um, the the victim's wife, and then there's the name of the police detective who was investigating the case and was questioned on it.
Right.
So there's three names you can instantly think of when you look at that, and then other handouts referenced the same name, and like stuff like that. So there's instantly little hooks in there for him to follow, but there's also the potential that the players are going to read these handouts, think, "Oh, that's cool," and then push them aside and never look at them. So whilst I've got potential leads, they are in the potential section. They're not guaranteed to get looked
Right.
at. So this content is not essential to the game. Ultimately, even the conspiracy content I've got is four locations, well, four and a half locations, and one that can happen anywhere in Arkham,
Sure.
depending on what you guys going to do.
So I think it's important, and you've set this up, that you have an NPC so
Yeah,
that you have a voice in the conversation, right? So the NPC can be subtle. The NPC can be a distraction when you need it to be, but it also can, you know, the NPC can be involved. The players choose to look, to involve the NPC in the conversation. You can tend to nudge them in a
yeah,
particular direction, right? I think that that's the less experienced you are with creating your scenario, the more you may want to include somebody, right? You want to avoid the NPC with the big red S on their chest, right?
Yeah,
That makes the players superfluous, that they feel like they're spectators. But, you know, somebody that's there that can, uh, give them information, move the story along, right? Like I said, sometimes it's wrong.
yeah,
So sometimes they tell you something and it's wrong, but in a lot of cases, if the players are struggling, that like we referenced the Warhammer game that we played in. Uh, when we ran, when we were like unsure of what to do, we would go talk to the like guard captain guy,
yeah,
and that would give you the opportunity to dialogue with us. We'd get a clearer idea of whether our thinking was headed in the right direction or not. Right?
yeah. And I think a difference between planning a campaign session to planning a one shot session does come down to that. Like, as long as stuff happens in a campaign, it doesn't really matter if you're making progress on the story.
Right.
Like, as long as you've done some cool stuff and it's been an enjoyable session, the progress is kind of secondary to that. Whereas in if you're planning a one shot or a shorter, like a finite amount of time, I think like I've designed outs within this. Like for Act One, you could have fought Lita and killed her before the ghouls arrive. Because you've got firearms and it's the 1920s and you're all just people. If you'd have popped out the door and just shot her, there's a chance that you just kill her.
Sure.
And whilst that kind of destroys the meta story arc,
Right.
I had a backup line of how that would go, and why I had a secondary NPC ready to contact you. So basically, the time shifts. You a day later, you meet with somebody else
Sure.
about what happened, and the story picks up from there. And narratively, a day's passed, but nothing's happened.
Like from a player's side on
Yeah,
that, the only thing I would have said, uh, it would have been when we ran into her, we weren't sure whether she was good or bad. And
yeah,
and and I get that, right? Like if that's what you were intending, then mission accomplished. If you if you wanted us to assume or you expected us to assume that she was on our side because, you know, the whole thing when we're investigating the house, there's this barrier and it seems like the barrier is what's keeping us in. So the person on the other side of the barrier is the is
yeah.
the adversary.
She was 100% the one keeping you in there.
Right.
So ultimately, and that's why I did it, because I knew that that was a potential that she's the one who was holding us in here while all this bad stuff was happening to us. And ultimately, she doesn't care if you guys lived or died as long as she managed to solve the problem.
Right.
Now that you've ruined the potential for her to solve a problem that way, you guys become tools for her to solve
Right.
a problem a different way.
I'm like it.
So,
So depending on your group,
yeah,
if you're running that scenario and you want the players to know that she is potentially on their side, you could have had her come to Sam's house the day before, asking some, like called at the house, and in your and when he sees her, he's like, oh, that's that woman who came to my house and was asking, if I was interested in selling it or something like that,
yeah,
right? So that you know because she expressed some sort of interest, whatever. So as a game master, if you want to lay out, flesh out things so that the players don't misconstrue, because I guarantee you that if you put things down and it seems really clear to you, that the players will have a totally different conception and they'll screw it up more
yeah.
often than not.
One of the big things that I did put in was that there's this magical barrier that blocks the exit to the house. It's the only way out of the house is through the front door. The only way to get to the front door is through the parlor, and there's a barrier on the parlor door. In the card game, it's fine because the only way, like, you take tests out of a bag until you pass have given them out of clues, and then the game tells you what happens.
Right.
So it goes into narrative mode. Whereas in a role playing game, it's kind of a cop out if I just narrative it. So I put in the way that you can get out in the in the card game that works. Then I gave a secondary way to do it that but it's kind of the same thing. So it's a flaming barrier. There's ice in the cellar and a bucket in the attic. In the card game, you go down to the attic with a bucket, fill it with ice, and then throw the ice into the barrier, and then it goes out and you can get out. So I thought, okay, well, there's a bucket. I'm going to keep talking about this bucket, and I've not talked about any other household implements and stuff like that. So that should set in that this bucket is actually
Sure.
an important part of the plot.
Yeah, because we were
Y-
struggling, or
Yeah,
they were struggling, and they thought that they had to find a way out through the tunnel,
yeah,
right? And you kept going back to this. Eventually, we
yeah.
sort of sorted it out.
Well,
Yeah.
the other things I added in that there's there's water in the bath, so you can take the bath water and do that. That'll put the thing out as well. But then I was like, well, maybe they don't even recognize the bucket, which is basically what happened. So there was the Elder Sign amulet. The player that was wearing that can just walk through a barrier.
Mm,
So uh, it at no point did you and you. I think your character was the one who had it,
right.
but you didn't interact with the barrier until you got a bucket and threw water on it. So it you never had to try and walk through it. But if you'd have gone near to it before that, you would have made it through.
Sure. Sure.
And then there was also so I
It's
just gave it
more the NPC. So when we knocked the
yeah,
barrier down, we went into the room. We have this NPC. We automatically. So because the order of engagement, we engaged her before we engaged the ghoul priest.
yeah,
We assumed she was our adversary,
yeah,
right? And so if you were worried as the game master that the players were just going to like murder death hobo her, you could have added something before, right? Oh, so and so, one of the players recognizes this person who had come to their house the day before, right? And then, they'd had a conversation or something like that. So that was contextualized, right? And then you proceed with the encounter with the ghouls and the leader of the ghouls, right? Or I think that sometimes you have to be very you might have to go over the top with a NPC that you put in that in your mind is clearly the players should realize that the person's goals are aligned with them.
yeah. And I think in this instance, I backdoored ways around it that I was if you fought her and she died, if you fought her, she attempts to flee,
Sure.
and then she'll come. She won't be there to help you, but you don't need her because you've got multiple other avenues. And as I was going to come on
Hmm.
to in the investigating section, I've made sure that there's ways and means of progressing the story without her involvement at all. If she dies, like if you shoot her in the head, if you like put 3 rounds into her and roll
Hmm.
max damage, I've got a little bit of narrative wiggle room there. That the cultists will like you kill her, she's dead. Then all these ghouls turn up, and then I would have just put like 20 ghouls coming up the stairs. You guys get to flee. They get to her body and drag it away,
Oh, sure.
and you know what I mean. So
Absolutely. I think
yeah,
like D&D, it's less of an issue, right? Because D&D, well, like whatever. But like if you don't,
revivifies a thing in D&D.
well, it's not even that. It's just that the players, especially inexperienced players, will struggle in Call of Cthulhu as to what they're supposed to fight and what they're not supposed to fight.
Yeah,
So there's things, and you know, they feel, I think, in a lot of cases when you're making your encounter in D&D, when the players see something, they assume that it is a obstacle, right? Unless you illustrate to them that it is not an obstacle, right? So the players automatically assume that if there's something there, that they're supposed to beat it up. And so you really have to.
so the one I would stress for D&D more than anything is beware of the tactical map, because the second you draw the tactical map out, the player's brains switch into combat mode, regardless of the type of encounter you've planned out.
or use the tactical map for everything.
Yeah,
So the first couple times that you draw out the tactical map and it turns out to be a role playing encounter sets them up for later on that they don't know, right? So if you sometimes use the tactical map and sometimes not use a tactical map, then you're dead on. As soon as you start drawing things out, the players are like, "Oh, we're going to get ready to roll initiative. Let's start killing stuff," right? Yeah. So unless it's really important that you draw things out all the time
yeah. I think
for
it's being
consistency's sake.
aware of the when you plan your encounter out. If you've mapped out the location, or if you're going to use one of the Pathfinder flip mats, which are really good, um, or if you've got like the tiles or whatever, if you plan out a location, and I'm doing it already, or I was going to plan out the house and lay it all out. Oh yeah, I think I'd grab the Manchester Madness tiles. I was going to build the house on those tiles,
Sure,
but I had everyone got there earlier than I expected, so I didn't have time to like get everything prepped because like I said, I didn't have as much prep time as I would have liked.
sure.
But I think that would have been better because the reason I didn't draw out a tactical map at the end is because I didn't want you to feel like you had to fight them because you can't win that fight.
Right. And that's
So
so just in that particular context, you have to be really careful in games like Call of Cthulhu, where resolution occurs outside of combat more than it occurs in combat.
yeah,
So it's like 80% thinking resolution, 20% stabby resolution,
yeah,
right? And so that's a much more challenging encounter because, especially depends if you play with a regular, if you've been playing with a Call of Cthulhu group for 6 months, yeah, they understand that. If you're
yeah,
playing a one shot or a two shot and you've got people that are unfamiliar with the system, then you have to assume that a majority of people's role playing experience comes from playing D&D or similar experience driven games, and their first response to most things is try to murder hobo it.
yeah. So, what else do you think about when you're planning planning a specific session? Do you do well? Bringing it back to D&D, I suppose. If you're doing like we've covered the role playing set like kind of session where you're looking to progress the story for investigation. We've covered the combat. What about the generally it's a shopping type of sessions where downtime and that kind of thing.
Sure.
I I think it's only really applicable. I would do a downtime session for the first like 15 minutes of a one shot, just to let the characters get used to the players get used to each other around the table. Let them interact when there is absolutely nothing on the line, and
Right.
that's what I tried to like you guys do. It's like I introduced character to Sam's character, then brought your character in, let you have like a little bit of role playing. You'd all had time to do any shopping before the game got rolling, and that's how I approached it for a one shot. For a campaign, I feel like having potential, depending on your group, I think you could do a full session of downtime. I know generally, I think the groups we've played in tend to do it. We do downtime between the sessions. I'd send you a note saying, whilst we're obviously not while we're in a dungeon, but if we're sleeping in an inn, like I wouldn't mind trying to sort this out in the next couple of days if we've got time. I'd
Sure.
go and get my armor cleaned or that kind
Downtime
of stuff.
downtime often occurs at the after resolution. So
Yeah,
if you leveled, so you've gained access to new stuff, whatever, give them the opportunity to go and get some stuff if that's the case. They're traveling from point A to point B and they arrive at point B, right? before you push them on to the next section of the story, you, they in their travels from A to B, they've come across the fact that, oh, we should have more rations, we need rope, we need this, we need that. When we were in this encounter and we really wished we had a pry bar or whatever,
Yeah,
it exposed the things that they didn't. So, I'm always, hey, is there anything you want to do while you first get here? Like, yeah,
yeah.
we get you set up, you're in an inn, you guys are good, right? Whatever the next day, is there anything you guys want to go do before we then start moving on, right?
And I find those personally, I find those parts of sessions really interesting and a really good opportunity for me to delve deeper into my character and the story I want to tell. And that's where I take those opportunities as a player. Uh, in those like role playing parts of the session, I'll express what my character wants to express, and I'm playing a monk at the moment who's with dating Thomas type thing.
Sure.
So I'm going every time I get
Monk
someone
is
new. I'll
in
go and
monastic,
yeah,
warrior, priest, not can you
yeah,
snatch this pebble from my hand?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so I'm going and I'm like praying in different churches and holy sites, like waiting for God to talk to me,
Right.
and and that's a driving part of the character. That
And that is obvious to the game master, me,
yeah,
that that's the case. And so then I'm like, okay, well, so you've illustrated to me the issue that the dilemma that your character's facing. And so now I need to think about resolution, but I need to, I think, I felt like I need to emphasize or I need to let this go on.
oh,
For,
I think we've spoke about this off camera and in the past that
right.
it isn't for the right for this character. It's not something that if it never resolves, I don't think it's an issue because it's part of who he is, and I don't expect it to never resolve. But it's not going to it's not going to suddenly get disappointed
Well, no,
and
but if
stop
I'm a new
doing it.
game master and my player goes to this church and it's pretty clear that he's like looking for inspiration,
Yeah,
I might feel that I need to address it,
yeah. And
right?
obviously, there's that expectation at some point
That's right.
something will happen, for good or for ill. But it's I
So as a game master, I feel like, I'd say to somebody, if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, I've got this player, this cleric in my group, and he's is having an issue with a question, a crisis of faith, and every time we go somewhere, he goes to these cathedrals and he prays and he's looking for inspiration. How do I deal with that?" And I would be like, I would let it go on for a little bit, right? I would let it it persist so that it is relevant, like it's poignant that this is what it is, right? And then uh, you might even have then an NPC interact with them, right? And like if you guys are in a static location and your character comes back to the church and is praying all the time, well, maybe the deacon comes out and he's like, "I see you in here all the time, my son. What troubles you,
yeah,
right?" Give the players the opportunity for a thing, like a role playing experience where you can interact with somebody. And I mean, I have resolution. I understand how it's
yeah,
going to occur, but I'm in no rush to
yeah.
execute it.
No, and I mean, I'm trying to use myself as an example because I think in the group we're currently playing in, we're a little bit light on that style of play. Um, I, with Jeff being new to his character and Jim being more focused on a different style of playing D&D, I try and express my character as an example of what kind of things you can do in that kind of time it's allotted. And I suppose it's coming on. This is like the player side of planning a session, of have stuff planned that I think when you make your character and you kind of like think about where they came from and where you want them to go, part of that's on you as well. So when the game master gives you these opportunities, if they've planned in time in the session, that time it might be for shopping, it might be for like recovery if you're playing a game that has a more gritty feel where you don't just magically recover all of your hit points all the time,
Sure,
and you're in recovery mode. Those you don't have to go into narrative time and just blast past them. You don't have to. Okay, I want to buy this, this, and this. How much does it cost? But say I want to go here and interact with this person. Is it gives you a chance to express your character, which gives your game master more stuff to use in the campaign going forward. And it's that collaborative work of playing in a longer running campaign. That's why I don't, for a one shot, I tend to do it right at the start for those reasons that it lets them get more comfortable in the skin and as a group kind of get more comfortable around each other and gives them a little bit of time to just flesh out like an idiosyncrasy a character might have because you don't have time to develop an
sure.
in-depth
A one
character for
shot, a one shot. There's not a lot of room for fluff.
yeah. But
Everything is progressing the story, moving
yeah,
everything along to get to resolution. Yeah,
and that's why I'll do it before it's effectively before we start rolling dice.
sure,
That this stuff
sure.
happens just to give them time to and one player might be not interested at all in just reading what all of their abilities do. And that's fine. It doesn't affect the game for naught.
And I
But
think
I
from the
think it's it's
go ahead.
definitely a point to look at more in a long running campaign. That these are times you should plan into sessions. It doesn't have to be
Yeah,
every session, but I definitely think that it adds to a campaign quite a lot if you can get your players to engage with it. And as a player, I think for me anyway, it definitely benefits me when I have those opportunities to explore the character in ways that aren't okay. I've got to put myself in danger again for these people, or how do I react to things when I'm not under life threatening
sure.
danger or in the middle of a grand conspiracy? How do I just live my life normally?
You've drawn your character out. You've drawn the outline of your character on the piece of paper. So I mean, you have, I'm this big. I'm this like. So you have this sort of like rough shape of what your character is. This allows you to color in the details, and I think that's really important. And so, like, I was more concerned when we first started to to get things moving because I knew that with some of the group they were inexperienced, and
Yeah,
so we needed to get them. We needed to put them in situations that they had to use their capabilities so that they actually knew what they could do, and that took actually a couple sessions, right? Where like they had to understand, as they were gaining some new abilities, they had to understand the synergy and so forth. So I have to put situations in so that they learn the mechanical side of their characters. But
yeah,
so now, for instance, the the wizard found a spell book. So up until now, he's just sort of been doing his thing. He expressed an interest in herbalism and alchemy and stuff like that, but then never really pursued it,
yeah,
right? So that's fine. I'm not in any rush. As he comes to terms with who and what his character is, maybe at some point he'll choose to pursue that. But now that he's got the spell book, he has to figure out how to get these spells out of the spell book into his spell book
yeah.
because he has spells in the new spell book that he will be able to use. And the spells that he has currently in his own spell book, he has got no second level spells except for the one that creates the like fortune telling card, right?
Yeah,
So there's a bunch of new second. So when I was like creating the spells, I made sure that I put a significant number there, that are reasonably well rounded situationally wise. So now I can see, you know, he's like, well, how do I do that? Well, now we need to go get some ink and all this other stuff. And so now he's got reasons. So when it comes to that downtime, he's got an agenda that he needs to like now he knows I need to like I spent all my money last week buying spells, right? And now I need to like
I
copy
pay
them
for
into
an
my
ink.
spell
Yeah,
book. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I mean I didn't emphasize I more so wanted when he went to the guild wizard, I could have held that you need to have ink and transfer it into your spell, the mechanical side of things and all that. But we were more so making up for the lack of diversity of the spells he chose when he made his character because
yeah,
he made like inexperienced choices when he was first maybe
Yeah, I think
generate.
this is the first spellcaster Jeff's played, so
Exactly.
yeah,
And I mean, I get that, right? And so we could have sat down and said, you need this and you need this and you need this, but it's his character. So it's better for him to see what he needs by seeing the inadequacies when he's playing the game. Oh, I sure wish I had mage armor, or oh, I sure wish I could cast shield, or I sure wish I had, some source of damage,
yeah,
other than this or that, like whatever. And so now that he's got the spell book, I'm I didn't emphasize the whole him having to pay for ink because he used all of his money to buy spells from the wizard so that he could
no,
round them out.
I've got money left. It'll be okay.
When you guys found some money, and
Yeah,
then there's all sorts of stuff like that. But now he's driven to find money to buy ink, to get the ink, and
it's
he's
an
going to spend.
expensive life being a wizard, man.
I know, and it's gonna cost him. It's gonna be a large portion. Like it might even be so much so that he says to you, "Hey, we need to take a job along our trip so that we can make some money, so that I can go buy some ink
Yeah,
before we set off into
and
the
that
frontier."
I would love that. I would go as a player. I would be happy to put my character into narrative time, doing some menial labor
Right,
to get some money. I enjoy that to me, that kind of stuff only adds realism to the game.
right.
It's like it's all realistically, if everyone could make as much gold as a D&D players do by being an adventurer, everyone in the D&D world would be an adventurer.
Or there'd be really large graveyards outside of all of the towns.
Yeah.
Well, there.
Like, oh, I could go and farm more potatoes, or I could just go and kill those two goblins over there, search for pouches, get my 50 gold, and like live like a king for the next year.
So yeah, so I think that from my side as a game master, we were talking about structuring sessions and everything.
Yeah,
I had to prioritize teaching them we hadn't played with them, but to teach them the style of game that I was going to run and what my expectations of them were as players, and then what their characters were capable of before I started placing external uh, demands on them.
yeah,
Right. So if I gone into all the niceties of this and that, it's too much. It's like when you get first, you're a brand new person, you buy the starter box, you come home and you're like, say to your friends, "Hey, I want us to play D&D." And then you're like, "Okay, so we're going to make characters, right? What do you want to be? Do you want to be a human or an elf or a dwarf?" And they're like, "I don't know." Right? Well, what class do you want to be? Do you want to be a fighter or a cleric or a wizard, or, well, I don't know, right? You're asking them too many questions that are uninformed, that they
yeah,
can't make these decisions. And so there's just too much. And then if you force them into making these decisions, then they regret it later because they're like, "Well, if I'd known." How many times have you heard from a player, "Well, if I had known when I decided that this was the spell I was going to take, right, that it would have an enduring consequence for the rest of the game, right, then I wouldn't have made that choice."
yeah,
And so you're just like, "Okay, well, let's deal with these things piecemeal. We'll let them figure this out, and then we'll tackle this." And then by the time, let's say you're like fourth or fifth level, they have a very now we understand what our character is capable of. We understand some of the desires of what our character wants and who they are, right? And we have a glimpse into what they want. Like
yeah,
where do they want to go from here? And if you have an experience group, that occurs. Like your character had all that at first level,
yeah.
right? Theirs didn't. And I mean that's and I felt like rushing them along was the wrong choice.
No, I think it's got that balance between getting people rolling dice and the campaign going. And I think we did brute force the campaign into starting a little bit because we'd been jonesing a little bit to get playing again. It'd been a while since our last game stopped and we wanted to start playing again. It was more about getting the group together and starting rolling dice. than
Sure.
it was having the perfect preparation. And I think that comes down again to, like, to kind of close out this episode, I suppose, that I don't put your session off or waiting for it to be perfect. I think I've run sessions where I've literally had just the bullet points I spoke about at the start, and if you nail those bullet points and the session runs fine, and the players might. I'm sure there's sessions where I put loads of effort in that Warhammer game where you would have thought that I ad libbed it, and there's been sessions that I ad libbed that would have been awesome. I think we've spoke about in the past where like the Squig Hopper stuff, a lot of the fun road encounters were just stuff I made up, not in the car on the way to the venue type thing, but the night before, this is what I want to do. This should be fun. How can I make it work? Yeah, that
Sure.
should be okay. And then I'll just fudge it on the table type thing. And as long as you've got some kind of groundwork and you've got those ratios down, I think that's the core of planning any session. And understanding your group is important for which one of those three switches you need to flick the most.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't like, we've talked about this repeatedly. I think you said you don't have to have the perfect, you don't have to plan everything out. You should plan a rough outline and then let the players have an adventure.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, that is the course of it. You will succeed more often than not if you have a rough idea of the things you want to tackle and you fill it in with the things the players want to do, right? Because ultimately, as the saying goes, right, they're not playing your game. You're offering the opportunity to experience their own game. So the choices they make are you know you want to put signposts along the way to get to inform them as the options they have, but ultimately it's up to them to make the choices and experience who their character is. And I think if you do those things and you you know you know you you know what your players each player's sort of favorite things are or expectations or whatever. And as long as you touch on all those things, right, you'll end up with a successful session. I don't think you can go wrong unless you kill them all.
yeah. No, yeah. Don't plan your session with total party kill as the desired outcome
Unless, of course, you want to just,
99% of the time.
unless, of course, you're done and you just don't have the heart to tell them and it's time to move on to a different game.
Yeah. I think that's a good wrap up for it. Planning the total party kill is probably not the best solution to your problems if
Well, I
you
don't
want to
know.
have people to play
You know,
with
maybe you
again.
wanted to go to a movie.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have one of the new Reaper Gold or Reaper Black. I think it's Reaper Black. The Owlbear miniature. If you're watching
And that's like
on the
that's
YouTubes.
exclusive, right? That you cannot get through one of the packs. I think
I don't know. No, I
it
think
it didn't come in the first wave.
I don't know.
I,
I got it from the store, the Sentry Box in Calgary. So I'll give that away for this episode. If you want me to paint it for you beforehand, just let me know if you win, and I'll paint it
Ooh,
as an owlbear. I know it shouldn't be overly complex, but I'm gonna keep it simple because we had a dearth of entries for our last one. I think we made it too complex. So all you need to do if you would like to win the Owlbear is just head over to the Dice Hate Facebook page, and there'll be this episode 3, and just put a comment in there saying that you would like to win the Owlbear and what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes.
so who
So,
who won our bear from last week?
Ed Horn,
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
yeah. I may have told him that there weren't a lot of entries in it, and to just shoot an email across because there's a pretty good chance you win, and he did. So Ed gets the. I'm going to send him the unpainted grizzly bear. So there you go,
Oh,
Ed. I'll send you your grizzly bear or your grizzly.
that's right. So if you're like looking in your database for bears and you can't find any of them,
because
Just
you
type
needed a grizzly.
just type in grizzly.
Yeah. Yeah, it means I get to keep my painted one, so that's good.
Nice.
Uh, Thanks everyone for listening, and you can check us out obviously on our YouTube channel. It's a Dice Hate. We are on the Dice Hate podcast as well. If you listen to this in audio format, you already know. You can find us on Facebook at Dice Hate on Facebook. The link should be in the video or podcast description. You can follow me on Twitter, Dice Hate Kris, and Instagram. I've been doing a lot of painting and updating recently. That's also Dice Hate Kris. So yeah, and I don't think Greg does social media, so yeah, check it out if you want to follow him.
I'm hiding.
Yeah, you can stalk him on Steam, maybe see what games he's playing. Spoilers,
Come by the store and tell us the D&D story.
yeah. And yeah, thanks for listening and watching, everyone. Really appreciate it. Been doing well. Still, X-Wing podcast is still winning though, so Greg's sad about that.
I am.
Yeah, and thanks again for coming on, Greg. We'll do it again in 2 weeks.
Perfect.
Bye.